Hi guys. Hey, welcome to week 5 of Social Work Policy and History. Hope you're enjoying our class. Week 5, can you believe it? Time flies when you're having fun. I hope you all are having fun and learning a lot. This week we're talking about the Progressive Era. We're in week 5, and this week I want you to focus a lot on how this part of history is really the beginnings of modern day social work. So this is when the United States began the Sanitary Commission, which I think it's interesting to note that, like many bureaucratic organizations, it evolved, it grew, and it was basically run by men. Men had the final authority, but what's interesting is part of the reason we call this the progressive area is that more people were able to become involved and progress was able to happen. And part of that included women holding more prominent positions in a lot of different areas, particularly in the United States Sanitary Commission. And of course, I think it's important to note that the Sanitary Commission is one of those basic necessities as human beings, right? We need to be able to have a safe place to eliminate the waste, right? And so sanitation is an important part of our livelihood and making things safe and okay for us. And women were prominent in this movement. Another thing that happened is this is post-Civil War, and so there were a lot of changes going on. Women played a lot of important roles during the Civil War. Nurses, spies, abolitionists, civil rights advocates, and then of course promoters of women's suffrage. A lot of the women were supplying the troops with food and clothing, and there were a lot of notable women during this time period. We're going to talk about several of them today. The first I want to discuss is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she was a passionate abolitionist. Also, she was the author of the famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very important book. I'm sure many of you have read it. I think I had to read it for a high school class, and I'm glad I did. It changed a lot of my perspective. And what's so cool is that so much of how we think today is very different than how people thought back in that time. One of the prevailing myths pre-Civil War and during the Civil War and even post-Civil War was that African American people were subhuman, that they did not have the same value as Caucasians. And one of the beautiful things that literature does is it changes how people think about different topics. And that's what Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, did. It brought these people to life. It helped the reader recognize that people of African descent are indeed individuals in their own right with their own needs and desires, and they're both good and bad. And so I want you to compare it with like maybe some of the television programming you might watch today that has changed your attitude towards some social policy, and even other electronic media that we use, well, that's what literature has been since the 1400s when the Gutenberg press was invented. It has changed people's attitudes and changed their minds. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe is an important figure, an important individual that helped change the thought process, that helped brought about the whole Civil War and freedom, the abolition of slavery in our country. Another important individual that you need to take note of, and we talked about her a little bit last week, and that is Jane Addams. I have a really good PowerPoint in this module for you about her, and it goes over a lot of her childhood influences, her father, her older brother's succession of wives that were mother figures to her, some better than others. And it kind of helps you see how Jane Addams' attitude came about and how she became the person that she was. Of course, she was the founder of Hull House, which was one of the first ever social work institution in Chicago. And very important individual and someone we can all emulate, whether we're men or women. Another one is Mary Todd Lincoln. So Mary Todd Lincoln, of course, was Abraham Lincoln's wife and very interesting individual. She did a lot to influence her husband, who in modern time we recognize that he struggled with bipolar disorder, and a lot of the times he was really struggling with depression, and then he had his mania phases as well. But he was more on the depression end of that spectrum. There are many believe that Mary Todd Lincoln also struggled with mental illness, and we know that after the death of her husband, she was actually institutionalized for a time. There are those today who would argue that she did not have mental illness, but more of a PTSD type situation. And also, there are some who believe that it was just a vitamin B12 deficiency, and that caused some of her what might be thought of as more bizarre behaviors. A lot of our contemporary physicians would argue that perhaps it was just that the expectations of women in that day were different than who Mary Todd Lincoln portrayed herself as. She was a very strong individual. Another woman who I think made progress, helped us come into this progressive era, was Louise May Alcott. And again, a writer, someone who wrote literature about the era. She wrote from her heart. She told her own family's story in her book, Little Women. And many of you have read that book. It definitely, for anybody who might come from a more traditional upbringing, it's kind of a must read, because it's very empowering to women in a traditional culture. Whether your own family subculture is traditional, or if the culture around you, which maybe ours isn't as much now, but back in the 1800s it sure was. And that was what Louisa May Alcott was raised in. She was very much a tomboy in her upbringing. If you're familiar with the book or any of the movies about Little Women, you recognize her, the character Jo was the character who Louisa May Alcott was when she was young. So literature makes a difference, and I hope that perhaps you can do some recreational reading. I know you've got so much reading to do in all of your classes, but when you have time, I hope you will take a look at Uncle Tom's Cabin and Little Women and other books that were set in this progressive era. Very interesting week. Again, don't hesitate to call, text, or email me if you have any questions or challenging situations. You all seem to be doing really, really well. I'm pretty proud of you. But don't hesitate to call. I love to chat with you. It's kind of hard teaching all these classes online instead of face-to-face. So, bug me. Talk to you later. Bye.